Welcome to yet another video. In this video, we're going to talk about working with APIs. So in this video, we're going to dig a little deeper into APIs. We're going to go over using an API using two different Python modules, requests and URL lib. Then we'll talk about constructing parameters for the query so that we don't have to hard code it like we did in the previous example. And then we'll do a couple examples using APIs. Then finally, we'll finish off the section talking about when we would still actually rather web scrape than use APIs. Okay, so let's jump right into it. For our first example, we're going to look at the OpenNotify API. This is a free open source API that has some NASA data. So let's go to the website now. So this API can tell us things like the location that the International Space Station, the ISS, is currently at. It'll tell us when the ISS will pass over a certain location, and it will also tell us how many people are in space right now. So looking at this website, you might see all this data, and you can see it's updating. And again, as web scrapers, our instinct might be to go, hey, I could write a BeautifulSoup script to get this data as often as I want. And here it's obvious that this data is being updated by the API on the page, and that we can use that API. But it might not always be that obvious, right? So it's good to do a little work to make sure that you find the originating source of the information before writing your script and before resorting to web scraping, because the data on the page might be being updated by an API. So anyway, let's write a script to fetch this data. And we're going to use both the URL lib and the requests modules for a bit of variety. Okay, for our first example, we're going to use URL lib. So we're going to go import URL lib.requests. And then to convert the JSON to a Python dictionary, we're going to use the JSON module. So import that as well. Then we're going to get a response from the query URL lib.request.URL open. And the URL that we want is this. And so you can see we're using the OpenNotify API, and we're requesting not an HTML file, but a JSON file. So to get the response string, we can go s is the response.read. And then we can take a look at S, and you can see that it's a byte string that looks like a Python dictionary again, right? You got the curly braces with the key value pairs. But this time you can see that this has a nested key value pair, right? So this is a nest, this is a key with the position, and then in that there's another object with both the longitude and the latitude position. And then you convert that to a Python object by going obj equals json.loads, and then we can pass that string in it. But this actually isn't going to work because the JSON object has to be a string, not this sort of byte string. So to get around that, go decode.utf8. And now we should have our Python object, and we can get the position for both the latitude and the longitude. And like before, I recommend you using gets as opposed to square brackets to index the keys, just because if you mess something up and the key doesn't exist, you're just going to get a none type back. You're not going to get a key value error. But you will get an error here because you'll have a none, then you'll be requesting get on it. So to get around that, if you're using nested requests, which you'll often have to do, put curly braces as the fallback. And then this will return just an empty object, and then this will return none. So the safest method to get sort of nested key pairs is to supply it everything with these. And that way, even if this key is messed up, you get a none type back. As opposed to when this isn't there, you'll get an error. So that's just sort of a handy little tip. Now, the other method that we're going to use is using the requests. And this is actually a cleaner, nicer little method, just because everything's a little bit more self-contained. But we go import requests. The response is the requests.get. Pass the location. Get the object from the response.json. And here we are. So I would use requests over URL lib. It seems to be taking over, but your choice really. Where it does make a bit of a difference is when you want to pass parameters to it. Now that was a very nice API because it didn't require any authentication, or what's known as an API key. And so most APIs require this because they're used to track which users are making which requests, and so the API maintainer can limit how frequently certain requests can be made by specific users. And the other reason they're used is because not all APIs are free. When you're using somebody else's data or using someone else's tools, that typically costs them money. And so you'll often have to sign up to use an API, and we'll talk more about that later. So again, in keeping with the NASA theme, we're going to be using NASA's free API directly this time. Although this API is free and it's public, it does require you to apply for an API key. So let's take a look at the page now. And so this is the NASA API portal, and it's open source and free. And you can see that the first thing it says is that you have to apply for an API key. So let's take a look at that. And this is all you have to fill out: your first name, your last name, and your email, and you can enter how you're going to use the API. And what that'll do is it'll provide you with a rate limit of how often you can make your requests. So I've already done that, and I'm just going to show you how to include parameters in your requests. So again, we're going to import requests, and then we're going to create a Python dictionary called parameters. And here the key is the parameter name, and the value is the parameter value, obviously. So we're going to set our longitude to be -79 and our latitude to be 45. These are the parameters for Vancouver, Canada, where I live. You can obviously put in your own. And those aren't all the parameters that I need. I'm going to show you that this actually isn't going to work because I haven't included my API key. But now we can go our response equals requests.get and include the website. And so this API call specifically is about getting pictures of the location that you've provided. So it's actually interesting. You can get satellite imagery of Vancouver, BC in this case. And then to include the parameters, instead of having to do something like this, where in the string we hard code a question mark and then long equals -79 ampersand lat equals 45. That will obviously work, but it's not very readable, it's not very maintainable in comparison. So what we can do instead is we just close that off, and then we set an optional value params equal to parameters, our variable. And now we can take a look at the response, but the response is actually 403. So if you look at that, it's going to say that the API key is missing and hasn't responded accordingly. So I'm going to include my API key in the parameters as API key. And I'm not going to give you my whole API key because you should get your own, but it's very simple. All you have to do is provide an email, your name, and make a request. And now we can re-get a response, this time going requests.get, including the website, and assigning params. And now let's take a look at the response. 200, which means okay. Let's take a look at the content. And so what it's provided us with is, I'll just convert this to JSON real quick. And to make it a little bit easier to read, I'm going to import pprint, and then pprint.pprint the response.json. And so it looks like there's only one image right here, but what it will do is it'll provide you the date and the time and the ID of the picture and a link to the picture. And like I said, I prefer the requests module to the URL lib module, but for the sake of completion, let's assume that you want to use that because maybe it's a standard. To do the same thing, you have to include these three libraries, so urllib.requests as well as .parse to provide the parameters, and then JSON to, again, decode the JSON to a Python dictionary. And I won't write all the code out, but I'll just paste it in. And this provides exactly the same thing. So here we have the parameters. We encode the parameters into a query string. We just add the URL with the question mark, and then we append the query to the end of it. And then we do convert it to JSON to the Python dictionary using all this and decoding it. So you can see, it's not quite as elegant, it's not quite as clean as the requests module, but in the end it will do exactly the same thing. So let's finish off this section talking about why web scraping is still a reality though. So although APIs can be nice and clean and efficient, not all websites are going to have APIs, because if people can just use APIs to grab a website's data directly, then the website just costs money to host, and it isn't getting people to actually come to the website to look at their ads. And nothing is really stopping you from hosting your own website that just replicates data on another website and be its competitor. So a lot of APIs require authentication and they cost money. And that's partially why web scraping is still popular and convenient for getting data, because it's free and it's usually very easy. Also, not all websites have APIs. The other thing is that often web scraping is about gathering large sums of data for one-time use. So setting up all the infrastructure to make repeated API requests is kind of unnecessary, because you're not trying to request one specific thing, you're trying to request everything all in one go. And finally, a big reason the web scraping remains a reality is because sometimes there just isn't another way to get the data. So in summary, we've talked about some of the things to look for and consider before relying on web scraping. We've also talked about how to use APIs, which I think is very valuable. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't include that in a course on web scraping, but it's just another method of making requests to a server and parsing the response for data. So I think they're in the same family, and I think it'll make your life easier to be able to recognize which tool to use and when. And finally, earlier we talked about when not to web scrape, so we closed with when to web scrape and why it's still a very good tool to have in your arsenal. So thank you very much with sticking me throughout this course. I had a lot of fun making it, and I hope it was enjoyable and informative for you too. So I wish you good luck with your projects. Thank you very much.